crisis up until 2019 combined. Now it's going into reverse. As we speak, it has just started to reverse. And this process of tightening up monetary policy and figuring out where will be the correct level for the Federal Reserve to stop on its interest rate hikes as well. Let's not forget that we saw the biggest interest rate hike in a single move from the Federal Reserve since 1994 in its latest meeting, 0.75% in one go. This will eventually, with higher oil prices, be eating into some of that story of the stronger global economy. So it does matter. But the key question will also be for emerging markets, how much more will you see interest rates needing to rise there as well, when we know that external pressures can come in on exchange rates and the need to at least follow how global interest rates are moving. Will it be synchronized or not? At least short term, we would argue that that pressure cooker with the steam coming out, the reopenings in particular of tourism around the world, and Thailand included, that should be the positive that we should focus on first, before we then start worrying about the other litany of other headwinds, shall we say, that are rising, including on commodity prices. So we know, for example, the Russia-Ukraine situation does add to these pressures because, take, for example, sunflower seed oil. It's used in so many processed foods. You can see the price moves that we've had in that. You look at, say, how wheat has been performing, and we know that higher food costs, in particular in emerging markets where it occupies a larger portion of consumer spending, is a major issue that we would be focusing on through the rest of this year and longer term. There are social implications alongside the economic ones. But the key thing I would also stress is this pent-up demand story. It's a clear thing at the macro level across all of the advanced world where we've seen pent-up savings and accumulated savings from not being able to spend on the things you're used to. Those things now you can, and that's been released. And labor markets are so tight. So until labor markets start turning substantially, I wouldn't be as concerned about the slowdown. That will come maybe by the end of the year or next year, where we should get a bit more concerned about these issues. In the meantime, we're seeing wage growth being relatively strong, participation rates in labor markets, take for example Australia, UK is not too far off, have been coming back, and there is also the added pressure on wages because there has been a lack of migration. But that also is now likely to change. We'll start to see a lot more of the migration trends coming back too. So when we think through all of these pressures, think first of the recovery and the reopening story, particularly in the experiences economy. We've been noting a pickup in spending on things has been doing very well from tourists globally, but now spending on experiences has been overtaking that as economies have opened up to more activities in the experiences space, and we should see even more of that as well. Now, I mentioned the pressure cooker and I mentioned the travel recovery. Here's how we view this from looking at our data for travel bookings. So starting, for example, with a place that's much more advanced in the process of opening up than we see in Asia Pacific, the United States. Here I show you domestic versus international travel bookings re-indexed to Q4 2019 equals 100. So you can see the drop-off at the start of COVID and then the recovery that we've been seeing ever since, more than recovery. And interestingly, domestic and international doing relatively well there, and the ratio in the US is back to normal in that way. But also, interestingly, consumer, but also corporate travel has been coming back. And there are many reasons that we can talk through on the explanations of why that has been doing so particularly well compared to expectations. Yes, it has lagged behind consumer travel recovery, but it has still been a robust turnaround. And if I just change the view, so I'll give an example. For example, I'll show Singapore. And you can see, as soon as you get those green lights turning around, you see that pick up straight away on international bookings. And of course, alongside this, the cost of travel has been rising too. And that has been a major focus around the world. Reports of people paying, say, business class fares for economy tickets, and these extreme moves in prices will ultimately matter, but only after we finish releasing this pressure from the pressure cooker. There's a good example, and I'll show one more for Thailand, just to show how and this is only as of the end of March. We've gone even further since then, where we can see that recovery is also taking place. And therefore, the bookings are there, the arrivals of tourists come next, and that's where we should see even more of the reopening of the key tourist areas, especially in an economy that has such a large scale tourism industry as Thailand does. And already, compared to just a few months ago, you can already see and feel the different buzz in the airports. And the key challenge, though, will be on providing enough of the workers to go alongside that. That's why we're seeing the wage pressures and services. Will there be enough flight attendants, engineers, pilots, and in particular the airport workers, the planes, the supply chain disruptions from what still has been a disrupted supply chain because of the zero COVID policy in China? All of these things will matter for short-term inflation. But I should stress, longer term, we should see some response in demand from some of the rises in prices once the pressure has come out of the pressure cooker. And instead, we should then start to see a little bit more of a calming down and stabilization, as we've been seeing, for example, in the US or in some of the data that we have from Europe. Two final parts before I stop. First one is on the story about the shift to digital, on the use of e-commerce. And the interesting part of this story is, while it has been a clear trend around the world, including, say, here in Thailand, for many years, even before COVID began, there was a clear spike, as we see here with our numbers for retail spending, e-commerce share, our estimate for the whole economy, spiking around April of 2020. Again, we had another spike in August of last year. But interestingly, the pattern has been, as we have reopened up, while many more people, younger and older, are comfortable in using e-commerce and more used to it, and they may never have done it previously, the key difference now is that people also want to get back out and about. They want to go into the stores and have those experiences once again. So no surprise, really, that the ratio has come back lower, but interestingly, we are still above the trend line. And in many markets that have been evolving in this way, there has been that acceleration because there's been so many new merchants starting in the digital-only format, for example, so many entrepreneurs to be supporting that are new startups that are coming in that are still deciding where to exactly locate their offering. And that comes back to the debate that I won't go into on to what degree the CBD areas of cities versus residential areas are going to be the ones that are busier, that are seeing more foot traffic. Major questions for us to think through longer term, and happy to talk about that offline. One final point before I wrap up, though. Given the conference and what a wonderful honor to be able to show some of this, is the MasterCard Index of women entrepreneurs that we had from the 2021 annual numbers. And the key thing that I would stress here is that we did, of course, see major setbacks during COVID. We know there was, by the World Economic Forum's estimate, a whole generation worth of heading towards equality that was lost, and there's a lot of ground to be made up. We know that participation rates dropped disproportionately for women, and there's major challenges that are still to be had on this front as we reopen up. But the key thing I would stress is there were some significant pockets of strength, and in particular around, including in the ASEAN region, you can see that actually the rankings-wise and the index numbers around, say, this region are relatively strong, and particularly strong, we would say, in markets including Philippines and Thailand. But happy to talk maybe more about some of that and what we had from this report some maybe later. So in the interest of time, though, I'll pause there. Thank you so much for your attention, and wishing you a very successful conference ahead. Thank you.
Thanks, David. You certainly took us around the world, and I love your analogies. Talked of everything from, COVID, travel recovery, the war in Ukraine, supply chain issues and commodity prices, but the tight labour market is a big one for many countries around the world. I love the technology. You have data scientists in your remit at MasterCard, so that's fantastic. I'm now going to, I think it's a great segue to the challenges that what David's presented relate to women, to Justin Sargent. And Justin, if I can ask you to make your way to the lectern. Justin's the president of Nielsen IQ Asia Pacific, based in Singapore. And Nielsen IQ is a measurement and data analytics company providing views on consumer and markets in over 90 countries. He has served as president of Nielsen China and Pacific. He's MD of India, UK and Ireland, and retail executive UK executive director of Nielsen Australia. So worked all around the world. Over to you.
Terrific. Thank you very much for the introduction. I should say Sawati Krab. It's sensational to be here. When Irene invited me, it took about a nanosecond for me to say yes, because I just know what an inspiring, important and forward-looking summit this really is. And even last night with the opening ceremony, thanks to the Thai organizing committee, it was extremely impressive, very inspiring, and fantastic to see what a wonderful and beautiful this country we have here as well. So look, David has set the scene already, so I have a few minutes just to talk a little bit about navigating disruption in an unequal world, because I think that's a very important point, that there are lots of things happening, but they're not happening to everyone at the same time and in the same way. And obviously we're going to talk particularly about the differences in genders in the short speech that I have. I think to start with, and these will be no surprises to anyone, the amount of change that has happened in the last 2 years is probably unprecedented in our history. We've had wars and all sorts of stuff over the years, but if you just look at the amount of economic, social, societal change that has occurred as a result of external events in the last year or two, it fundamentally has changed people's outlooks and their lives. COVID obviously was the huge factor, happened 2.5 years ago. Overnight, people were working from home, worried about their health, people were losing their lives, their livelihoods. This was a dramatic event in our history. And of course, it had a lot of knock-on effects as well. We saw huge supply chain disruptions. We saw people reevaluating how do they get food to their home. They started getting a lot more digital. New business models were created. Some businesses didn't continue to exist, and we heard some statistics yesterday about many of those businesses were run by women. But right across the world, businesses had to change their models. And of course, just as we were starting to come out of COVID, we then had the Ukraine crisis, so the war in Eastern Europe. And that has created dramatic impacts, not just in Eastern Europe and Europe, but increasingly felt around the world. So, as David talked about, we have grain prices, oil prices, energy prices rocketing, and that is affecting the price of goods and, again, the livelihoods of different types of businesses. And throughout this, we've seen a lot of change in consumers as well, that they are thinking differently. What was important to them 3 years ago is a lot less important in many cases now. So you have this whole range of different factors, and as we've already seen, this is having an economic impact. So we are starting to see the forecasts shrink across the world. As David said, Asia's been a little more protected to date, but we're starting to see it in this part of the world as well. And you can see some of the inflation numbers by market on this particular chart. Right across the board, the prices are coming up. And I think the general consensus is this is likely to get worse before